Hikaru Nakamura, the Blitz Beast, opens this game against Magnus Carlsen with pawn to a3. Not a proper opening. It's known as the Anderson variation, named after Adolf Anderson, or Adolf as you might say in the States, because he played it way back in 1858 against Paul Morphy. Now, it's not had a name update in 150 years. It really feels like it needs one. I was thinking about trying to name it, but I think we should try and come up with something together. So whoever can think of the best name for this thing, please do help me out and I'll run with it in future. Now Magnus, not to be outdone here, he goes pawn a6. So Hikaru tries to give Magnus a taste of his own medicine, because Magnus has been playing opening garbage, by the way. I've got a whole playlist on that one. Check it out at the end if you want some binge watching. But Magnus says, nuh-uh, I'm the king of opening crap. No way you're going to outdo me here. We now get g6, d4, bishop g7, knight c3 and d6. A trio of tiny little pawn moves from Magnus, giving Hikaru the entire centre here, a la King's Indian Defence from Magnus. Now this is a Title Tuesday game, played back in May 2023. Yes, it's an older one, but I love when these guys play, and nothing was really tickling my fancy at today's Tata Steel Chess 2023. Sorry, got a bug in my throat here. We're going to persevere. Knight f3 from Hikaru. So we've got a classical King's Indian defence on the board, but with these little bunny ears moves inserted here. Changes the nature of the position slightly. So bishop e2 now played, and c5 from Magnus. e5 a bit more standard, but he goes for this one. Hikaru decides he doesn't want the space. He just castles. Rook e8 from Magnus. You know, if d5, he'll look for e6, get some kind of Benoni style structure, but instead we get rook e1, and finally Magnus provoked to take on d4. Knight recaptures and b6, a double-edged move, not forced. You know, often you see this knight develop first, maybe to d7 here, and this is one of the reasons why. You know, Magnus wants bishop b7, but after bishop f3, he can't play the most natural move in the world, or he runs into e5. Deadly shot. Because after bishop captures here, very natural, well, the queen recaptures and you're on the undefended rook. You know, you never defended the knight. This is one of the problems. So say you now defend this rook with rook a7, will you lose a piece? And if you try and save the knight by taking the pawn, counter-attack here, well, you can flick in this, hit the queen, pawn takes, you pick up the rook, you're in exchange up, and look at that for a mangled pawn structure. I believe these are called Irish pawns. No offence to the Irish, but you've got the triple whammies there. I believe it originated from some tournament in Ireland or something. Can't remember the details. Anyway, so that's why rook a7. Very unnatural looking move, but it does a job. Bishop e3 from Hikaru, bishop b7 now finally played, and Hikaru goes for the most natural idea in the world here, pawn b4, but it's not actually the best move. Amazingly, a4 is best. Looks a bit nasty, weakening this square, but this is a horrible threat to meet. If you go a5, you severely weaken the b5 square, and if you just carry on developing like this, well, a5 is just a killer, because you're ripping open this diagonal basically. Really nasty to deal with. If you take, for example, knight b3, coming to here, hitting the bishop, this one's open, big advantage to white. So that was a nice idea. Missed. b4 was played. Knight bd7, Magnus develops and he is coming right back into this game despite giving Hikaru the centre. Rook c1, rook a8, we've got a great battle on our hands here and the finish is just sadistic, but who knows who wins it, they're so evenly matched. So we get knight d5, wonderful central outpost, so e6 evicts that strong steed. We get takes on f6, Magnus recaptures with the bishop. Why not the knight? Looks natural. Well, now he's got 3 pieces keeping tabs on e5. There are so many tactics in the air with this pawn push. If the knight sits there, it gets way more dangerous. So this the best move, and now Hikaru should do something like knight b3. Start thinking about the c4 pawn and protecting it. But he goes g3 here, rook c8, starts to target this pawn. We get bishop g2, bishop g7, queen b3, adds some defense, knight e5, renews the attack, and now Hikaru sheds the pawn basically. He's got a trick in mind, and he got me wondering, what if you go f3, protect the center, prepare bishop f1? Well, it's definitely playable. Black stays a bit better, you can start nibbling away, generating an attack, but okay, it was a playable move. Black attacks though. But what Hikaru does is pawn h3, stops any knight g4 still, but now after queen c7, hitting this pawn, you can't go bishop f1 or you lose the center. So knight f3 played instead, but now knight takes on c4. Magnus wins, a clean pawn here, but here's the tricky tactic that Hikaru's got planned. Can you find the move? So Hikaru comes up with bishop takes on b6. Nice tactical idea. You can't take with the knight or you lose your queen here. So queen takes played and now the knight drops on c4. But there's a problem. Rook takes, rook c8, queen moves, and this rook invades, supported by the bishop. Magnus has picked up the bishop pair and he controls the open file, hitting a weak pawn. Pressure on. So knight d2 from Hikaru. Great tricky move. If you capture this pawn, you run into knight c4. Forking queen and rook, no good. So the pawn not touched. Queen c7 played, dominating the open file. Knight b1 hits the rook, protects the pawn meekly, but this is grim. It's passive. Rook c2, queen d3. Now this pawn plows down the board. h4, natural response, not allowing the pawn structure to be mangled, giving this bishop some room to run around. We now see rook b2, preparing invasion, rook d1, and such a Magnus move, he takes the ladies off the board. You know, no time to take here, or you crash through here. So we get captures, rook captures. I never explored what happens if takes, but presumably check, pick up the knight, that looks good enough. So bishop f3 played instead, preparing king g2 and bishop e5. Magnus turning the screw with the bishops, holding the pawn, pressuring the king. We get king g2, bishop c6, more micro improvement of the pieces. Knight d2 from Hikaru, and now this is a nice move, bishop to d4. Eyeing the f2 pawn, just slowly squeezing. These bishops coming into the game. And now rumour has it that it was at this point that Hikaru's wife, Atusa, entered the room with a particularly pungent bowl of ramen noodles. The scent of those wafting through the air into Hikaru's nostrils, up into the brain chamber, and bang, a brain fart hits Hikaru. He plays an atrocious move in the fog, dazed, confused, goes king h3. He just drops the pawn on f2. Inexplicable unless you know the context of the delicious meal that had been prepared. And now this is great for Magnus. He is what? One pawn up with the bishops and the pressure. Hikaru struggling. So bishop g2 played. Rook c3 hits 2 weakened points. So bishop f3 covers this one. And now Magnus, the sadist, a minute up on the clock. He doesn't even take this pawn here. He just starts squeezing. Tricky moves. Hits the rook. It moves. Hits the bishop. So bishop e3. Hits the knight. We get this ping pong of attacked pieces. Hikaru now hits the rook. So rook b3. Pressures the knight. Keeps the rook honest. So we see bishop e2 targeting the a6 pawn. Magnus doesn't defend. He just goes bishop d4. Says take the pawn. Do your worst. Hikaru doesn't. He goes knight d2, maybe worried about bishop takes, bishop e5, pressure here. So now, after rook takes here, which was played, and bishop takes here, well, he's prepared to meet bishop e5 with pressure there, with knight f3, let's say. So instead, bishop c2 from Magnus, opening up the eyes of the rook on the a6 bishop, defended with pawn b5, rook a2, eyes this knight. Now we get rook e1, defending e4, preparing to then move the knight and hold on to the pawn. Bishop d3, knight f3, hits this bishop. Who's going to blink first and make a huge blunder? Well, bishop f2 comes from Magnus, hitting these ones, rook c1, and everything is collapsing. Magnus picks up the e4 pawn. The knight is hit. I'm not sure I've seen so many forcing moves, hitting pieces in a row in a long time. And Hikaru's just stuck for ideas. If he plays knight g5, very natural move, escaping the attack, hitting the bishop. Well, now there's this check and the king's in a world of pain. If you step back, then there's the discovered check and you pick up the rook. So what to do, right? If you go here, will we still check, still force the king back, still win the rook? It's just game over. So the knight can't even move. b6, desperately tried, looking for a baby girl. But bishop f5 check now from Magnus. I mean, you literally didn't need to do that. You can take here, you can take here, you can take here. Everything wins. Okay, Magnus goes for this. King g2. Now the pawn drops. King h1. The bishop comes back. Knight about to drop. Defended. Bishop f2 hits the pawn. King g2 covers. Bishop c5 check now played. Opening up the rook once again, king h3, and you can literally take this bishop straight off the bat. But here Magnus does this, liquidates, now wins the bishop, and here resignation from Hikaru. He is a bishop down. Just a fun little gem from Title Tuesday there. Love it when these guys meet. And if you want to see an entire playlist of Magnus playing absolute opening garbage, check out the video on screen. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.